Thanks, John, and thank you to NAS for inviting me to this conference. This is a real milestone for me. You see, back in 1966, I dropped out of graduate school in Berkeley, just short of a PhD, to join the revolution full-time, meaning I went to work for Ramparts magazine. So I became a journalist instead of an academic, a career choice that left my immigrant Jewish mother very disappointed. You could have been someone, she would tell me at least once a year. You could have been a college professor. And since then, I've often wondered whether my mother was right. Did I miss out? Not becoming a tenured radical first, and then a tenured conservative. However, my friend Fred Siegel, Professor Fred Siegel, constantly has reassured me that I really didn't miss out on anything except maybe for the fat university pension. Anyway, I'm on this panel because as a journalist, I've written quite a bit about the issue of social justice teaching in CADA education, and that's what I'm going to talk about. My theme is that your problems with social justice teaching and political indoctrination in the university really isn't all that different from what I have observed in the public schools. Let me illustrate my point with a new twist on an old joke. It goes something like this. Question: why is 120th Street in Upper Manhattan the widest street in the world? Answer: because it separates Teachers College from Columbia University. Professors at Columbia used to like the joke because it appeared to absolve them from any responsibility for the rather low academic discourse at Teachers College. But things have really changed. 120th Street is suddenly much narrower. There is no Berlin Wall between the academy and the ed schools or the nation's public schools. For better or worse, the academic culture on your campuses is powerfully affected by what America's public school teachers do in their classrooms and by the training they receive at places like Teachers College. I want to elaborate on that point this morning by talking about two paradigmatic and widely influential figures in K-12 education. One of them is Paulo Freire, the late Brazilian revolutionary and self-styled educator, and the other is the American revolutionary and self-styled educator, William Ayres. Going back to my days in graduate school in the 60s, not in our wildest imagination could I or any of my Berkeley comrades have dreamt that a turgid Marxist tract published around that time by an obscure radical community organizer in Brazil would eventually become one of the most widely read volumes in the ed school canon. Since the English edition was published in 1970, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed has sold 1 million copies and achieved near iconic status in the ed schools and increasingly in the academy. In 2003, David Steiner and Susan Rosen examined the course curricula of 16 top-ranked schools of education and found that Pedagogy of the Oppressed was one of the most frequently assigned texts. And as I said, Freire's books do now show up in university humanities courses, where there still are humanities courses. The odd thing is that Pedagogy of the Oppressed is not really about pedagogy, properly understood. Freire is uninterested in any of the issues that have troubled education reformers throughout the 20th century: testing, standards, curriculum, the proper training of teachers. It is rather a political manifesto calling for the overthrow of capitalist hegemony and the creation of classless societies. Freire's rather unoriginal idea is that the central contradiction of every society is between the oppressors and the oppressed, and that only revolution can resolve the contradiction. For support, he cites the works of such great educators as Marx, Lenin, Mao, Che Guevara, and Fidel Castro, all with footnotes, mind you, good scholar, as well as radical intellectuals like like Franz Fanon, Regis Debray, Herbert Marcuse, Jean-Paul Sartre, Louis Althusser, and George Lukács. And that's because Freire never intends his pedagogy to refer to any method that will produce higher academic achievement for students. His theory of schooling refers only to the growing self-awareness of exploited workers and peasants who are using the classroom to, quote, unveil the world of oppression. So how did this derivative, pseudo-scholarly book about the depredations of capitalism ever get confused with a treatise on education that might help solve the problems of 21st century American inner-city schools? One of the main reasons, I think, is that in the United States, pedagogy of the oppressed resonated with progressive educators already committed to a, quote, child-centered rather than a, quote, teacher-directed approach to classroom instruction. Freire's rejection of the teacher's role as a purveyor of objective knowledge in a classroom seemed to buttress what was already the ed school's most popular theory of learning. And that is the progressives' idea that teachers should no longer be a sage on the stage, but rather a guide on the side. That's literally a quote and a slogan often heard in the ed schools. So students should work collaboratively in constructing their own knowledge with just a little help from their teachers. Freire's strictures reinforce another cherished myth of American progressive education, that traditional teacher-directed lessons left students passive and disengaged, leading to dropout rates for minorities and the poor. Freire's declaration in Pedagogy of the Oppressed that there was, quote, no such thing as a neutral education has now become a mantra for leftist education professors who use it to justify proselytizing for various America-hating causes in the classroom. Here and there, some honorable leftists have recognized the dangers to academic integrity in this obliteration of the ideal of neutrality. The noted literary critic Gerald Graff, a former president of the ultra-politically correct Modern Language Association, rejected the Freirean model of teaching. Quote, as he said, "What right do we have to be the self-appointed political conscience of our students?" asked Graff. Given the inequality in power and experience between students and teachers, students are often justifiably afraid to challenge our political views, even if we beg them to do so. And that's in the university. So the situation far worse in K-12. Despite such occasional dissent, Freire's call for teaching for revolution has continued to prosper, both in teacher education and across the street in the academy. And nothing illustrates that point more than the remarkable academic career of ex-weatherman William Ayres. Ayres also disproves F. Scott Fitzgerald's famous aphorism that there are no second acts in American lives. Bill Ayres' spectacular second act began when he enrolled at Teachers College in 1984 after he came up from the underground, and I don't mean the subways. He planned to stay just long enough to get a teaching credential. But the ex-terrorist experienced an epiphany in a course taught by Professor Maxine Greene, a leading light of the Teaching for Social movement and a follower of Freire. Ayres took fire from Greene's lectures on how the oppressive hegemony of the capitalist social order, quote, reproduces itself through the traditional practice of public schooling. This is the fancy Freirean way of saying that the evil corporations exercise thought control in America through the public schools. Greene told future public school teachers that they could help change this by developing a transformative vision of social justice and democracy in their classrooms. Her vision, though, was a far cry from the democratic optimism of the founding fathers, Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King, Jr. Social justice theorists like Greene nurse a rancorous view of an America in which it is always 2 minutes to midnight and a knock on the door by the fascist thought police is imminent. Thus, Greene felt herself anointed to use the nation's K-12 classrooms to resist. She urged teachers not to mince words with children about the evils of the existing social order. They should, in her words, portray homelessness as a consequence of the private dealings of landlords, and arms buildup as a consequence of corporate decisions, racial exclusion as a consequence of a private property holder's choice. This was music to Bill Ayers' ears. He glimpsed a new radical vocation. In record time, Ayers acquired a doctorate with a dissertation titled, quote, "The Discerning Eye, Accounts of Teacher Self-Construction Through the Use of Co-Biography, Metaphor, and Image." Ayers' research consisted almost entirely of a few days spent interviewing and observing the classroom practices of 3 nursery school teachers he knew personally. With his Teachers College diploma in hand, Ayers landed an ed school appointment back in his hometown in Chicago. 2 decades earlier, he had roamed the streets of the Second City along with his Weatherman gang, beating up city workers. Now he quickly became the distinguished professor of education and senior university scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He also was elected by his ed school colleagues to the position of vice president for curriculum of the American Educational Research Organization, the country's largest organization of education professors and researchers. In an interview, Ayers said of the terrorist phase of his life, quote, "Guilty as hell, free as a bird, isn't America a great country?" Instead of planting bombs in public buildings, he pursued a new career planting the seeds of resistance and rebellion in America's public schools. Graduate students signing up for Ayers' course titled On Urban Education received these exhortations from the professor's website. Homelessness, crime, racism, oppression, we have the resources and knowledge to fight and overcome these things. We need to look beyond our isolated situations to define our problems globally. We cannot be child advocates in Chicago or New York and ignore the web that links us with the children of India or Palestine. Several of Ayers' books on the moral imperative of teaching for social justice became bestsellers in the ed schools, and Ayers continued to turn up from time to time as a guest lecturer at Teachers College, where he always received a hero's welcome. The official college publication, Inside TC, sounded like a groupie describing a rock concert when she described Ayers' appearance. Quote, "A man sporting sunglasses, an earring in each earlobe, khaki pants, a sweater, and tweed jacket strode purposefully past the entry and down the hallway towards the auditorium. His intensity and passion were tangible in the way he walked through the crowd. He was the speaker for the evening, William Ayers, a former leader of the radical Weatherman organization in the 60s. Ayers not only believes in the obligation to assist people on the bottom, he acts on it." In 1997, Ayers and his mentor, Maxine Green, persuaded Teachers College to launch, by the way, I apologize if there are any Columbia professors here. You know, I don't mean to single you out. Anyway, he persuaded Teachers College to launch a series of books on social justice teaching, with Ayers as editor and Green serving on the editorial board, along with Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia. More than a dozen volumes have appeared so far, including one titled Teaching Science for Social Justice. You might be wondering, science for social justice? Let Teachers College professor Angela Calabrese Barton, the volume's principal author, explain. Quote, "The marriages between capitalism and education and capitalism and science have created a foundation for science education that emphasizes corporate values at the expense of social justice and human dignity." So what's the alternative, according to Professor Barton? Quote, "Creating a science education that is transformative implies not only how science is a political activity, but also the ways in which students might see and use science and science education in ways transformative. They always use that word, transformative. Everything is transformative. Transformative of the institutional and interpersonal power structures that play a role in their lives. I guess that means if you're a parent and you still can't appreciate why it's necessary for your child's biology teacher to teach for social justice, you're probably hopelessly wedded to reason, empiricism, individual merit, and other capitalist and post-colonialist deformities. And then there's Eric Goodstein, a Marxist colleague of Ayers at the University of Illinois, and also a full-time Chicago public school teacher. Goodstein's book, Reading and Writing the World with Mathematics Towards a Pedagogy for Social Justice, combines critical pedagogy theory and real-life math lessons that Goodstein piloted with his predominantly minority 7th grade students. Goodstein reveres Paulo Freire and approvingly quotes Freire's dictum that there neither is nor ever has been an educational practice that is neutral. Thus, Goodstein has relentlessly politicized his math classes for years, claiming that this approach has improved his students' math skills while making them more aware of the injustices built into capitalist society. One of Goodstein's classroom lessons, for example, presents charts showing the U.S. income distribution, aiming to get the students to understand the concept of percentages and fractions, while simultaneously showing them how much wealth is concentrated at the top in an economic system that mainly benefits the super rich. So after the class does the mathematical calculations, Goodstein asks, "How does all this make you feel?" In his book, he triumphantly reports that 19 out of 21 students described wealth distribution in America as, quote, bad, unfair, or shocking. And he proudly quotes the comments of a student named Rosa. "Well, I see that all the wealth in the United States is mostly the wealth of a couple of people, not the whole nation." I guess Rosa was thinking about George Soros. America's historical ideal of public schooling as a means of assimilating all children, and particularly the children of new immigrants, into a common civic and democratic culture is already under assault from the multiculturalists and their race and gender-centered pedagogy. The followers of Freire and Bill Ayers, by dismissing the civic cultural ideal as nothing more than capitalist hegemony, subvert the public schools even further. But Freirean teaching is incapable of liberating the children of America's so-called oppressed. There is not one shred of evidence suggesting that the pedagogy behind teaching for social justice works to lift the academic achievement of poor and minority students. As the scholar E.D. Hirsch has shown, traditional academic instruction is the only way that those children are likely to obtain the cultural literacy and the content knowledge that could make up for the educational deprivation they suffer in their homes. The last thing they need is a wild-eyed experiment in education through social action. Unfortunately, there is little chance that social justice can be challenged from within the closed thought world of the education schools and the larger academy. Only the taxpayers who pay for the public schools and many of the ed schools can address the issue through their elected officials. So what can be done? At the very least, legislators and public officials should demand that state education boards establish guidelines forbidding teachers from indoctrinating students with their own political ideologies, whether left or right. This ought to be the educator's Hippocratic oath, to do no harm. Thank you.